What's up, legends? Listen carefully. Today's video is not just history. It's about you, your money, your future, and the invisible system you're living inside right now, whether you realize it or not. Let me ask you something, and be honest with yourself. Have you ever wondered why you work harder every year, yet your money feels like it buys less? Why your savings grow slower, but prices rise faster? Why governments tell you everything is stable, but somehow you feel more stressed, more uncertain, and more trapped than ever? And here's the real question that nobody asks out loud. If every country is drowning in debt, who is actually winning? And why are you the one paying the price? Today's video exposes the answer. And trust me, it's not what you think, because the truth is this. The financial system you live in today didn't start in 1971. It didn't start with Bitcoin. It didn't even start during the 2008 crash. It started in 1914, during World War I, when governments discovered the most profitable weapon ever created, money that is no longer real. And once they unlocked that power, they never gave it back. By the end of this video, you will understand why your savings lose value even if you do everything right. How inflation is not a mistake, but a design. Why every crisis looks the same, because the playbook was written 110 years ago. And most importantly, what you must understand today to avoid becoming the next victim of a system built to make you pay for mistakes you never made. So if you've ever felt like the economy is rigged, if you've ever wondered why the rich survive every crisis while ordinary people get crushed, if you've ever looked at your bank account and thought, why does it feel like I'm falling behind no matter what I do not click away. Because by the time this video ends, you will finally see the truth that has been hidden in plain sight. The truth that explains your struggles, your anxiety, your financial stress, and the world you're living in right now. And trust me, once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let's begin. The hidden financial front of World War I. This was not merely a conflict of trenches and heavy artillery. It was not exclusively waged with bayonets and barbed wire. World War I was also a battle of finances, one that occurred in gold reserves, bond markets, central banks, and the clandestine offices of financiers who never entered the fray. The soldiers sacrificed their lives. Meanwhile, the bankers and governments were focused on balancing accounts. Their actions during those years not only influenced the outcomes of the war, but also reshaped the global financial landscape in ways that continue to affect you today. If you believe war is solely about political maneuvering and military forces, reconsider. The First World War demonstrated that money can serve as a weapon, and it is one of the most lethal ever created. The collapse of the old order, the gold standard illusion. In 1914, Europe was already on the brink of disaster. National disputes, colonial goals, and military alliances had transformed the continent into a landscape of suspicion. However, beneath all the rhetoric surrounding honor and empire, a grim financial reality existed. Fighting a war of this magnitude required staggering amounts of money. The harsh reality was that when leaders opted for war, they were also opting for debt. Each empire advancing troops to the battlefield was also leading its citizens into a future burdened by economic strain. Despite this, in the early days of the conflict, most governments anticipated a swift resolution. Perhaps by Christmas. They believed they could finance it in a traditional way, through gold, limited borrowing, and patriotic contributions. Within a matter of weeks, that notion shattered. The war consumed money at an astonishing rate that no one could have predicted. To be specific, during the summer of 1914, Europe's financial system was still based on the gold standard. Nations assured that their paper currency could be exchanged for actual gold, a framework that lent credibility to currencies, but also restricted government actions. Gold reserves were limited. One could not simply print endlessly without risking the trust of the populace and creditors. Britain, France, and Germany each had respectable gold reserves, but as millions of men were called to arms and industries shifted to weapon production, expenses soared. By late 1914, Germany was spending over 10 million marks daily, while Britain's wartime expenditure would soon escalate to £2.5 million each day. The calculations were ruthless. The gold would not endure, breaking the anchor. The authorities decided to suspend the regulations. Gradually, the leading nations forsook the gold standard, subtly letting their citizens know that currency had become a mere promise, reliant on trust in the government. That pivotal moment, the severing of the gold tether, marked one of the most significant changes in financial history. It demonstrated the inherent vulnerability of what was considered a nation's real wealth. Currency and influence were now liberated from precious metals and propelled by printing presses, credit, and persuasive tactics. Once governments experienced that newfound freedom, they never reverted to the old ways. The financial struggle had now truly commenced. National strategies and failures. Germany, the Pyramid of Hope. For Germany, cut off from international capital markets and restricted by the Royal Navy, the sole alternative was to borrow domestically. Berlin initiated extensive bond campaigns, appealing to national pride and encouraging everyday citizens to invest their savings in war loans. The propaganda was ceaseless. Posters depicting valiant soldiers, households urged to give up comforts for the country, and continuous assurances that investors would see returns following victory. Overall, Germany managed to raise over 100 billion marks through this method, but it was a structure founded on optimism. When defeat occurred, those bonds lost all value. Millions of Germans witnessed their life savings vanish, and that resentment paved the way for extremism in the ensuing decades. Economic history invariably leaves scars. Britain and the rise of Wall Street. Britain, on the other hand, possessed a significant advantage. The City of London served as the world's financial center. The British pound was reliable, and their financial networks extended worldwide. Initially, the government relied on short-term loans, treasury bills, and appeals to patriotism, but it quickly began to access more substantial global credit sources. Importantly, it turned to the United States. In 1914, America maintained an official stance of neutrality, but its financiers recognized a chance for profit. Companies like J.P. Morgan and Company became essential to Britain and France, facilitating enormous loans and overseeing the acquisition of weapons, food, and raw materials. By the time the United States entered the war in 1917, Wall Street had been supporting the Allied effort for several years. This was far from philanthropy. It was a demonstration of influence. American bankers generated millions in commissions, and the United States emerged from the war fundamentally changed, shifting from a debtor to a creditor and transforming from a financial follower to a leading global power. If you're curious about how the 20th century evolved into the American century, this is where it starts. Not on the front lines of battle, but in financial records. France and Russia, debt and ruin. France encountered its own set of challenges. Already strained by the expense of fortifying its defenses and haunted by the legacy of the Franco-Prussian War, it depended heavily on loans from both local and international sources. French citizens, historically known for their propensity to save, were encouraged to purchase government bonds. However, much of the more substantial funding again originated from across the Atlantic. Similar to Britain, France grew increasingly reliant on American financial support. This reliance would influence post-war politics as significant debts emerged and repayment became a contentious issue. When considering the economic turmoil of the interwar period, it's important to recognize that it involved more than just reparations or fluctuations in stock markets. It also encompassed the overwhelming burden of debt acquired during those 4 years of devastation. On the other hand, Russia's financial warfare was a catastrophe. Although the empire was expansive, it was underdeveloped, with a fragile banking system and gold reserves that looked impressive on paper, but were inadequate in reality. To finance its military campaign, Russia borrowed extensively from its allies, especially France. However, as military losses accumulated and inflation skyrocketed, trust in the ruble diminished. By 1917, the the Russian economy lay in ruins, and so did the political structure. The downfall of the Tsarist regime was not solely about ideology or incompetent generals. It was also tied to a financial framework pushed beyond its limits. Economic errors, monetary disorder, and inflation contributed to the revolutionary fervor. Once again, money and authority intertwined throughout history. The cost of detachment. The magnitude of the financial blunders was astonishing. By war's end, the Allied nations had expended over $140 billion, while the Central Powers' expenditures were around $60 billion. These amounts were unprecedented in history, surpassing the total pre-war national incomes of the nations involved. This led not only to towering debts, but also to the collapse of the previous financial system. The gold standard, which had been the cornerstone of global confidence, was broken. Inflation surged through various economies. Germany would soon encounter such severe hyperinflation that a loaf of bread would cost billions of marks. Ordinary people, workers, savers, and small investors, bore the brunt of this crisis. In contrast, affluent elites frequently insulated themselves by relocating assets internationally, purchasing tangible goods, and remaining close to power centers where information was disseminated first. The harsh lesson was unmistakable. In financial conflicts, the small savers are the first to suffer. And here lies the crucial connection for you today. World War I marked the point when governments realized they could fund the unthinkable by disconnecting money from tangible value. They learned they could suspend the gold standard, print money indefinitely, issue bonds to their citizens, borrow across borders, and subsequently repair the damage with propaganda and restructuring. Does that ring a bell? For this strategy has persisted over time. Every recent crisis, from the Great Depression to the global financial crash of 2008, reflects remnants of 1914. When governments or central banks assert that this is temporary or that the fundamentals are sound, recall that in 1914 they were making the same claims. And millions were convinced, right until the currency in their possession became worthless. The post-war financial trap. When the fighting ceased in 1918, the world resembled a war zone not only in trenches, but also in financial ledgers. The United States, once a nation in debt before the conflict, emerged with the largest gold reserves and the greatest creditor status in history. Meanwhile, Europe, once the center of global finance, found itself overwhelmed by debt. Britain owed more than $4 billion to the United States. France was in debt for over $3 billion, and even smaller countries were caught in obligations they could never realistically satisfy. The war transformed Wall Street into the new financial epicenter of the world, displacing London in a manner no weaponry could accomplish. The era of American financial and political supremacy had commenced. However, this transition was fraught with difficulties. The fundamental issue was that when wars are financed through loans, the process of repayment turns into its own struggle. Britain and France, eager to uphold their commitments to their citizens who had purchased war bonds, found it necessary to extract funds from Germany through reparations. The Treaty of Versailles imposed a staggering amount, 132 billion gold marks. Its purpose was to punish, incapacitate, and transfer the burden to the vanquished. Yet it was also an illusion. Germany was simply incapable of meeting this obligation. Each effort to comply, whether through printing more currency or delivering goods, further destabilized its economy. The hyperinflation of 1923, where Germans had to use wheelbarrows full of devalued currency just to buy bread, was no mere coincidence. It was a direct result of a financial system pushed to its limits by unmanageable debts, and it sowed the seeds of anger that extremists would later exploit. The cycle of instability. During this time, Britain sought to reclaim its financial prestige by reintroducing the gold standard in 1925. Fixing the pound at its previous pre-war value. However, this was yet another colossal economic blunder. The British economy had suffered tremendously, its industrial foundation weakened, and its debts soaring. Restoring the pound to its former parity was akin to forcing a broken bone back into place before it had healed. The outcome was deflation, rising unemployment, and social unrest. This policy, advocated by prominent figures such as Winston Churchill, is now viewed as one of the most significant significant financial errors in contemporary economic history. Once more, it was the average workers who suffered while the elites maintained their illusion of restored greatness. In contrast, the United States, abundant in gold and credit, faced a different dilemma: how to manage its newfound supremacy. American banks began to funnel money back into Europe, lending to Germany so it could fulfill its reparations to Britain and France, who could then repay their debts to America. It was a financial cycle that appeared stable on the surface, but rested on illogical reasoning. The Dawes Plan of 1924 and the Young Plan of 1929 formalized this monetary flow. Funds were being recycled rather than generated anew. When the global economy trembled during the Great Depression, the entire system came crashing down. The world had never been as financially interconnected nor as vulnerable.
This is why the First World War should not be dismissed as merely another section in military history. It was a crucial turning point in economic history, where financial errors and misconceptions altered the course of the future. The war illustrated that governments could abandon the gold standard, inflate currencies, and borrow on an unparalleled scale, all while convincing their citizens they were acting in their best interests. It demonstrated that propaganda could transform debt into a sense of patriotism, that ordinary savers could be persuaded to relinquish their wealth for bonds that would ultimately go unpaid, and that the true beneficiaries of war were frequently those in boardrooms rather than those who fought in the trenches. The intertwining of money and power became tighter than ever, and the world has been grappling with the repercussions ever since.
Conclusion: the Unchanging Playbook. Reflect on your current life. When central banks assert that inflation is temporary, when governments routinely raise debt limits, and when new money is digitally created at the touch of a key, recall the events of 1914. Remember that the abandonment of the gold standard was a deliberate act born out of desperation. Keep in mind that the trend of borrowing against future resources, printing money to address current needs, and selling bonds adorned with patriotic messages dates back over a century. Each economic crisis of the modern era is rooted in those wartime years, from the 1970s stagflation to the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis. The same deceptions persist, and once more, the same individuals, the average saver, the middle-class worker, the small-time investor, are those asked to make sacrifices. The concealed financial struggle that unfolded during World War I is not merely a historical footnote. It underpins today's reality. The truth is difficult yet essential. Money, once removed from its tangible basis, turns into a means of control. Governments will always discover avenues for funding conflicts, bailouts, and crises, and they will invariably find ways to make the populace bear the burden, whether through taxes, inflation, or the reduction of their savings. Genuine wealth transcends mere digits on screens or politicians' pledges. True wealth encompasses resilience, knowledge, and the capacity to see beyond illusions. That is the only financial liberation that history permits. And here's the concluding thought to ponder tonight. While history doesn't repeat itself verbatim, it does have its echoes. The financial strategies conceived in 1914 have been repeatedly applied, cloaked in new terminology, and presented with fresh justifications. Nonetheless, the result remains consistent. Those in positions of authority safeguard themselves, while the uninformed are left to shoulder the consequences. If you take away anything from this narrative, let it be this: never take for granted that money is genuine simply because it is produced, and never believe that the system is sound merely because the authorities claim it is. The reality is consistently obscured within the balance sheets, and history is the only instructor that remains truthful. If this perspective has resonated with you, consider subscribing. History holds the insights, and I'll guide you on how to uncover them.